Just start.
Hello, how are you? I'm so glad to be here, and we're going to begin our lecture talking about churches. And actually, this entire lecture will focus on ministry and churches here in America and in Mexico. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about certain experiences. And as this is a class in intercultural ministry here in North America, I want to maybe just share some stories. Today's learning will happen through stories. And I think that is a great way to present information. And we've talked about Dr. Sharon Kim, who is the Cal State University professor of sociology who studied Korean American churches, mainly second generation, in LA County and Orange County. And when we think about Korean churches here in the LA area, you know, we think of immigrant churches, so-called second generation churches, churches with people have a mixed story, you might say, mixed stories, different backgrounds. Some people just arrived, some people have been in America for 30 years. We have churches with many different faces, you might say. We have churches who are very insular. There are some churches who are not interested in evangelism. The churches are almost like a small club, and they're pretty much like just maybe 50 or 100 people, and everyone is used to one another, and they just want to leave it the way it is, almost like a family-style church. But new people don't really come, and they're not really interested in having new people. That happens. I visited a church in LA that was like that. There are some churches that seek multiculturalism. They want to have people of various backgrounds. There are some churches who don't want people from a lot of different backgrounds. They just want people of their group. So you see both. So in talking about ministry here and intercultural ministry, I'm interested in your impressions and your developing ideas. So when I tell you these stories, maybe that will give you some idea of how you would interact, how you would do things if you were here. Now, a few years back, I went to an Ethiopian church in Anaheim, California, the same city as Disneyland. And I was invited to go to this church, and it was an absolutely wonderful experience. I've talked about this in some of the other classes because it was so special. And my wife and I, we were invited by a friend, and it was part church service, part graduation party, part dinner. And we went there was a sermon, there was music, there was dinner, there were speeches about a student who was graduating, the daughter of one of the pastors, and it was just very seamless. Now, when I say seamless, everything just happened holistically. The party, the church service, the music, the food, it was just like one big happening. And I really liked it. It was very organic, it was very natural. I didn't feel like there was in a way a defined program, but it wasn't like a very formalized, ritualized time. It was just everything came together. It was very holistic, very seamless, seamless. And after I left the church, I was talking to my wife, and I remember just feeling like that was just so special because it was just so holistic. And although the sermon was not in English, I was so moved by the sermon, which was in Amharic, an Ethiopian language. And I felt like I understood some of it just through the power of the Holy Spirit. The zeal, the happiness, it was just a tremendous, tremendous experience. So I ask yourself now, and of course, when we had the dinner, uh, no knives and forks, no uh, chopsticks. We ate with this bread that's made out of bark, and you just kind of lift the food up with this bread. So I have to ask you, how would you have done in that experience? Would would you have judged it in any way? Would you have enjoyed it? Would you have had questions? Would you have found it difficult to meet people? Would you have felt different because you don't speak Amharic or you may not look like most of the people there? Would you be afraid to eat the food, like because you were so used to knives and forks or chopsticks? Would you be afraid that you would make a mistake? Would you be bored because you didn't speak Amharic? Would you feel embarrassed because you weren't such a big part of it? All kinds of emotions and feelings happen when you're in an intercultural setting like that. And my advice to you is just to let it happen. You may have struggle with it a little bit, but relax and enjoy the experience. Enjoy not knowing the language. Enjoy not eating in a way that you normally eat. Enjoy food that you would not normally eat. Enjoy the music. Maybe it's music you don't normally hear. So everything was very new and exciting. Some people do not like new and exciting. They want everything to be familiar, everything to be what they're used to. They may not like being in that kind of a setting. I loved it. So, and once again, in order to build relationships, to be able to attend places that may not be similar to where you would normally go, let's say, or maybe you go to different sorts of places all the time. Just being open and loving and allowing others to share with you. It was just an amazing experience. I absolutely loved it. Now, south of the border in Mexico, I was on a very fast missions trip. And wow, we visited around 10 churches, and I remember visiting this one church that where most of the people in the congregation were the children of men who were in prison. They were in jail. And this church was a very basic church. It had a dirt floor. But I have to say that the joy that I felt there was so strong. Even though these families had so many obstacles with their father being in prison and the stigma of society and lack of funds, I saw absolute happiness and joyfulness. There was joyfulness in sorrow and joyfulness in gratefulness. Being grateful for what they did have, and it ministered to me. And even though I speak and understand some Spanish, I didn't understand everything that was being said there, but I did understand the context and I did understand the enthusiasm. And that was just wonderful to see that kind of love and that kind of gratefulness when the families were going through many difficult times. So I ask you once again, how would you do in that location? Maybe you attend a big gleaming megachurch. Maybe you attend a home church. Maybe you attend a street church where the sermon is in French. Regardless of where you are, you need to look at who you are and your identity and what you find, what you feel comfortable with. And I ask you, how would you have done in this church in Mexico? Would you have been so sad because the sadness of that situation, a crooked floor made out of dirt? Would you have felt comfortable because maybe you worship outside under dirt? Um, Maybe you speak some Spanish, so it would have been easier for you. Maybe you don't speak Spanish. Maybe Mexico is a country that scares you. Maybe you know nothing about the country. Maybe everything that you've heard, uh, some of it you wonder how well you would do. So maybe you would even fear for your safety if you were there. But these are questions that you need to ask and put in the hands of God to prepare you when you do go outside of your comfort zone and in ministry experiences that may be different than what you've experienced before. I can think of another place I went to in Los Angeles, and it was a neighborhood outreach. And there was prayer outside, and we were at a home at the courtyard, and there was some local promotion for the event, and there was a music ministry. Almost everything was in Spanish, and it was very welcoming. It was a wonderful experience. I really, really enjoyed it. And I felt I was accepted, even though my inherited identity may have looked different than many of the people who were attending this outreach. I felt accepted, but I also found ways to make other people feel comfortable with me. I didn't force it. Most of these folks were fellow believers, brothers and sisters, but for some, because I have blue eyes and because English is my first language, there could have been the potential for people to judge me in some way, even dislike me. But I didn't worry about that. The love of Christ was there, and there was a mutuality of faith. My friend, a good friend of mine, was leading that ministry outreach. And he, of course, introduced me, and that gave me a lot of credibility with the people in the group. So I think if you can have an in, if you can be known by the people that you are going to be associating with, just like when Paul was evangelizing in the Bible, he would go into temples because he had a history as a Jew. So in my case, I knew the leader, so that gave me some credibility when I attended and shared and talked. So those things can be very important here in America. Although if you're a stranger and you're new to America and you venture into a church, some churches are very welcoming, which is great, and you would be welcome. Some other churches, it doesn't matter where you're from or where you're not from. They don't really know how to welcome people. I hate to sound mean, but I think that's true in some cases. I've experienced it myself where, wow, they don't seem to know much about welcoming people. Not that I expect that, but sometimes if you're welcoming a non-Christian or a fellow Christian, there's a feeling of, I care about you, I'm going to acknowledge that you're here. Do you need anything? Do you want a glass of water? Do you need to know where the coffee is after the service? Something like that. So if you're familiar with someone, it can open a door. Sometimes when you're ministering to people, there's this whole issue of trust, having a level of trust. When I used to evangelize around LA when I was running with a friend of mine, sometimes we would hand out tracts. My friend who lived in LA would associate with people that he knew on the street, some people who the streets were pretty much their home. And so when I ministered there, there is a little bit of fear on the part of people, like, who is this person who is coming to pray with me or give me something or help me in some way? Just like if someone approached you or I or anyone, it's not, even though we can't just have this attitude of, oh, we're the people helping and the other people are the receivers, and that for some reason gives us some kind of special power. It doesn't. In fact, we are receiving. We are receiving. I know in another class I was talking about a woman who was around USC, University of Southern California. She was a large woman sitting in a wheelchair. She had a great sense of faith. I was teaching a class one day and I was asking the students, who do you consider to be a really great Christian? And I received a variety of answers. And when I answered it, I basically said, this woman who doesn't appear to have a home of any kind other than the sidewalk near USC, I felt that she represented being a strong Christian because she totally lived by faith. She was a Christian woman, she accepted faith, and even though her lifestyle may be different than you or I, she has so much to offer here. And that's not that we're just in relationship to get something, we're not, but I received by being in the presence of this woman, I received a great dose of ministry, a great example of what it is to be a Christian. You know, Jesus always turns, how do I say it, society's conventions inside out. He would, approach people, associate with people that maybe the Pharisees would think were not of a good rank or not of one of society's best. Jesus doesn't operate on that level, and as Christians, we don't operate on that level either. We want to get to know people. We want to find God in each and every person. We were talking about that earlier when we were talking about Dr. Ra. And in ministry and outreach, in business, you have the opportunity to reach out to people and show the love of Christ. Another place where you might be in the position to have an intercultural experience, of course, would be in Christian schools, high schools, universities, language schools. You can be put in the position of ministering in a very big way because you are in a position as a teacher or a chaplain, or you're a member of a parachurch organization that's doing construction. You're a soccer coach, football coach, whatever you might call it. You have the opportunity to minister, and the love of Christ will come through you. Pray to Him, and He will give you that faith and that ability to interact. So I encourage you to do that. You know, there are people that do not want to hear about church from a pulpit. They rather see the testimony and the work of a Christian in action, in a job at a university, doing volunteer work, or on a soccer or football field. So do not minimize your talents. People are waiting for you to share what you have. It all requires prayer that God will put you with the right group where you will make a difference, and also where you will receive gifts of the sharing of faith and experience by other Christians, and the opportunity to know a Christian brother or sister, or a non-Christian sister or brother that may be a future member of your Christian family. So that's important. You know, in America we have many, many, many denominations. I was speaking with a Ukrainian Orthodox priest. He was telling me about his experience coming to America as an immigrant. He didn't understand English very well. He studied it, and he was at seminary here for maybe 3 years and almost returned to Ukraine. He felt the English was so hard for him to learn, and it was very difficult for him. But God kept him going. And now he's the priest in a very old and respected church where he uses his Ukrainian and his English. And by the way, he speaks English quite well, and he has allowed himself to have opportunities to speak English. And I had a communications professor in college, and he told me something that made a lot of sense. And he said, it's not how you say something, it's what you know. And I firmly believe that. If you have what you would consider an accent, if you have a manner of speaking that you feel it may be difficult for people to understand you, yes, speaking can be important. Yes, speaking plays an important role in conversation. But God doesn't judge people on your speech. He judges on what you're saying, the content of what you're saying. So if you are pure in speech, pure in attitude, if you have godly communication coming through your heart, you're going to be fine. And you have to be willing to not be embarrassed, to give yourself time and give other people's time to benefit from that relationship, that connection that you're making, that struggle to get to know one another. Some of the best relationships that you can have are ones that you have to struggle before you get to the point where you can have it's a little bit easier. So you need to keep that in mind. There's nothing wrong with struggle. In fact, it's an opportunity for God's mighty hand to do a great work. We look at the Presbyterian Church in America. We see all different levels. We have PCUSA, we have PCA, we have KPCA, we have many different denominations. And these denominations, sometimes, the Reformed ideas are very similar, and Westminster Confession and all of that. But there are some that have different interpretations, different ideas about social issues, and you have to navigate within that. If you're a very conservative Presbyterian, you might say you may have trouble going to a Presbyterian church that might be considered not so conservative. But you must keep, in my opinion, the conversations open. And you must be able to feel the need and the comfort to share. And if you're in a conversation with a fellow Presbyterian and you feel uncomfortable because of differences about social issues, allow that discomfort to happen. You're going to feel it initially, but then the more you communicate with that other person or that other group, you are going to feel an ease. Just like Milton Bennett, when he told us about his theory of having intercultural finesse. He's a theorist I've talked about in other classes. You go through stages of comfort, and that kind of broad definition of intercultural studies, it doesn't just apply to quote unquote ethnicities. It could happen within denominations. So allowing yourself to communicate with people and to approach it with love is absolutely important. I have visited and participated in Pentecostal churches, and within the Pentecostal church, all kinds of ways of approaching things. There's a oneness church, there are Trinitarian churches, there are churches where you hear people speaking in tongues more than others. Excuse me. So you have a variety of situations. And once again, you need to ask yourself the question, do you want to be known as a judgmental Christian, or do you want to be known as a loving Christian? And part of loving is having conversation. Now, talking about churches in America, I think of one Pentecostal church I went to in California, and I attended this church. It was a very small Pentecostal church. I was treated very kindly, but I felt like there was something not right at that church. Just something didn't feel right. But I was there, and I needed to show gratefulness for being there. So I was there, I enjoyed what I could, and I appreciated the kindness that was extended to me, even though I felt that feeling that something wasn't right at that church. So, but there's even value in that kind of experience, because those of us who have been Christians for a while, and some new Christians, you develop what I call kind of a spiritual sensibility, where feelings can mean a lot. Like you walk to the church, you feel a heaviness of spirit. There was one church I had attended in La Mirada, California, where Biola University is, my doctoral university, and I went to this church and I absolutely loved it. I thought it was just great. And it was just wonderful. I loved the Spirit of God. I loved the spirited singing. I loved everything about it. The language was primarily English, but there was another language spoken there. And I just loved the church. I really, really did. Well, about 3 or 4 years later, the church got bigger, and praise God, and the church moved to another location in a town in Orange County. And I attended the church there, and my spiritual sensibility, the radar, if you will, went up, and I said, this church is not the same. I felt a heaviness of spirit. I felt like people were going through the motions. I felt like there were problems there. Even though there was a sermon and enthusiastic music and people working hard, I just did not have a good feeling. Something was holding things back. And those of you who have that spiritual sensibility, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't reached that point yet, you someday hopefully will develop that ability. Now, I was talking to someone who knew that church and told me more recently that the church is getting back, I think, what they had, meaning they're having more of that spiritual sensibility. So anyway, you just look at that and it gives you an idea of how you should approach things if you see yourself in a situation like that. Pastoral leadership seems to vary in a lot of different churches. You have some churches where the minister is very strong, other churches, minister is not so strong. So if you get involved with ministry here in the United States, that's something to be mindful of. And also, too, church structure, you may have many pastors, and they divide things into different, like pastor of technical arts, pastor of creative arts, pastor of, then the age group pastors, senior pastor. So there are a lot of different models for churches. So they're just really, really varied. I feel that some churches are top heavy in administration. They just have so many pastors that somehow I feel like it's so specialized that the holism of ministry is lost. So that's just my opinion. It's not true in every situation, of course, but it's something I've noticed. I traveled to the American state of Florida for missions work, and I also did some missions training down there. I also visited a mission. I also attended a workshop at Wycliffe in Orlando. So it was a very, very good trip, especially learning about how languages get translated and all of that. But we were doing evangelism at a big festival down there. It was a big strawberry festival. And it was very concentrated evangelism. I mean, we were manning a booth there, and it was a kind of evangelism where you would say, are you going to heaven? And people would give you a variety of answers. And if someone said they were not going to heaven, you would give an invitation for them to pray. There was not a lot of time to build relationships there. And I'm not saying I thought that was good or bad, but it was certainly very, very different. But you encounter that kind of thing here in America. The approaches can be very, very different. Well, when we were down there, we ministered to migrant farm families. So these were people who were out in the fields from other countries who were, um, picking vegetables, maintaining farms, and they lived in migrant housing with their families. And we put on like a vacation Bible school for them. So it was interesting on that missions trip too, because uh, our organizer had lots of plans, but God made it clear very quickly that he was in charge and not the leader of the missions group. She did a great job, but God had a tendency to change schedules and bring different opportunities for evangelism there. We also were one of the members of our missions team got very sick. She had an attack in a restaurant, meaning she kind of lost consciousness, and it was very dramatic. She had to go to the hospital. It was not a good her health suddenly, and she was a young person, but she had this health problem that developed. So those of you who have done missions work, you know about the importance of flexibility, and you know the importance of prayer and spiritual, if you will, we might call it spiritual warfare that goes on, and trying to keep on track and trying to not let the enemy win, but let God have his way with how we approach, the evangelism, in a gentle, loving way. And so you will see Christian schools who do a lot of these missions trips, and sometimes the Christian schools, we were talking about schools, universities earlier, sometimes they are places that really, really need a lot of ministry. Just because some place is a Christian school, it doesn't mean they always have their act together. And I think if you are from a country outside of the United States and you have the ability and permission to serve at a Christian school, I mean, there's a need for a lot of ministering, I think, that happens, and I'm sure you would bring a lot of your expertise. Your background would be very helpful if you ever decided to do that. I flew to Houston, Texas, and I attended a church there. It was a quote-unquote American denomination, a form of Presbyterianism, kind of a conservative Presbyterian. Most of the people that attended the church, from what I gather, were of Nigerian descent. And of course the worship was wonderful, and the dance-like prayer movements, and you might go to some Presbyterian churches where people are very staid and sitting. But at this particular Presbyterian church, there was a sense of orderliness, but there was, spirited dancing, spirited sharing, and it was just an absolutely wonderful time. Once again, gender, ethnicity, history, whatever the situation may be, we need to be willing to accept the spirit that we find in people. To me, it's not difficult, okay? I have my moments of difficulty but having been around so many backgrounds, so many ethnicities, religions, my intercultural understanding, intelligence is very high. So it's not difficult for me, but you may be at a different point in your journey. So I just encourage you, don't be afraid. Be willing to recognize the spirit. Don't always rush to recognize what's familiar to you, or how can this be similar to my home culture, whatever that may be. We have a tendency to do that, to feel some kind of comfort, like, oh, this is like my church, this is like my country, and that's okay. But we also need to be willing to acknowledge difference, but look at that Holy Spirit that comes through, that commonality of Holy Spirit, that transcends language, ethnicity, gender, background, education, station in life. It just melts that away. And we don't want to melt it away because we want to acknowledge who people are. I don't mean to sound like suddenly we just are, but it breaks down the barriers so you can speak to people and understand them and really value that Christian brother and sister. Now, in your family, you may have a brother or sister. Yes, you have the same parents, but that person may think differently than you do, dress differently, go to a different church, go to a different university, go to different restaurants that you don't go to. And yet, that's your brother or sister. And sometimes you have to work to get along, but it's no different than when you attend a church or a ministry where people maybe you perceive them as being different from you. There's that commonality of being a Christian. Now, you may meet Christians, fellow Christians, who do not have the intercultural ability that you have. They don't feel equipped to associate with people that are different than they are. So it may be up to you to be a little more helpful in having that person grow in intercultural finesse, which I believe is God's plan, that we find ways to have relationship and to spend time with one another. And, you know, being in Texas was just as a state, Texas definitely has its own culture. It's there's a lot of Texas pride. People are proud. People that are from Texas are proud of their state. There's even a Texas anthem to the state of Texas. There are some Texans who just feel like their state is the best state. So there's a lot of Texas pride, and there's also, and part of that Texas pride I've noticed is, I can't speak for everyone, but I've seen a lot of people that are very welcoming, and that kind of warmth, that gift of hospitality. I went to a rodeo with my wife, and it was an amazing rodeo. I don't know how you feel about rodeos, or maybe you're against them, maybe you're for them, but it was very interesting to see that part of the Texas culture with the cowboys and you know, the riding the horses and formations and the ropes and the cattle and all the different exercises they did. And then, of course, we had this huge Texas barbecue before with kind of the sweet but spicy beans and the special coleslaw and the certain kind of pulled pork. So experiencing the culture, even though it may not be something that you would necessarily go back to, let's say you didn't like the way animals were treated in a rodeo or something, at least if you found yourself at a rodeo, you've had the experience, and that may help you understand certain people that have that as a part of their particular culture. So I encourage you to, you know, be open and not be so judgmental, but to try to be understanding and try to put yourself in the position of the other person. This is their history, this is their background. And sometimes your knowledge of their background will be like a perfect catalyst, let's say, for conversation, because you can ask about the rodeo, you know, why it's important, how it came to be. And by learning a place's history, you learn more about the people. So ministering in the United States is not just church, and it's not just the church body. It's getting to know the greater culture. So as long as it's safe and it's in keeping with what you feel is okay, I would encourage you to get involved with cultural things here in America, even if you're afraid of the language barrier, because that learning will happen. Confusion is the first step in learning. The brain would like to know what's going on. So when you find yourself confused by certain cultural norms that you may see in America or language, that's okay. That gives you and your brain the opportunity to figure it out and learn and experience and even embrace the struggle. Because cultural learning does involve a struggle. I think it's all very exciting, but even I will recognize that sometimes it is a struggle. Um, but if you focus on, oh, it's such a struggle, you're not being grateful for the opportunity God is giving you. So, like we're here in California, we have surfing, like a surfer riding the waves on the ocean. That's who you are as you navigate culture and experience the ups and downs and the exhilaration, the fear, the water spraying in your face, meaning it being refreshing and exciting at the same time. And you're bringing the waters of Jesus Christ. And people need your refreshment and they need your refreshment. So that's something to think about. In America, I was talking about, the social issues that somehow divide people, and you need to ask yourself, where do you fit in? I know when I'm around people that are very much into social issues, they're very heated, they agree with something, and they disagree with something else. I'm not a very confrontational person, so I find it very, very difficult to engage in those conversations. Even though we're trying to teach you intercultural finesse and have the lack of fear of getting to know people, when I encounter these like angry activism, sometimes it's very difficult for me because that's not my style. I tend to be more of a forgiving person, but I must respect who people are. So, but I think knowing where you fit in, that doesn't mean you're not going to change your ideas. You may change your ideas, but it's good to be aware of that because we see a lot of it in America right now. People talking, people taking stands, people being polarized by a lot of different issues. So intercultural ministry in America, this is part of the scene, social issues. So you do have to measure your words sometimes and be careful what you say because that can destroy relationships very, very quickly. So I look at the East Coast and the West Coast. And, the East Coast, it's colder, West Coast, warmer. Sometimes the East Coast, not to generalize, sometimes very task-oriented. Cold weather, get something done. West Coast, sometimes a little more relationship-oriented. We have the nice weather. Yes, we have things we need to get done, but we want to take the time and develop relationships. If you are serving on the East Coast, you may even see less people in church than you would here in California. You may even be surprised when you go to some churches who've been there for years and yet only 10 or 15 people are going. So churches need missionaries. Sometimes it's inviting people back. Some may identify as being Christians, but they maybe are not wanting to be a part of formal Christian communities. And they may have very good reasons. And I'm not saying everyone has to be, in a church every Sunday. Do I think that is important? Well, I do think it's important. I mean, I love going to church, and when I, for whatever reason, have to miss church, it's not a good feeling I have. I need to go. I'm one of those people that I want to be there. But not every Christian is like you, and not every Christian is like me. They may have various reasons. I do believe evangelism is needed in the church because you have people who may identify as Christians, but they they may not be, they may be so angry, or they may be involved with social issues, that they look upon church as an institution from which they can espouse their ideas. And sometimes I think they lose sight of who they are holistically as a Christian. They may zero in on social activism or something else, or and the church goes through those times. Historically, change happens when activism can occur, and so. But when you're around people in places that are so heated up, and so when I say heated up, I mean they're angry about things. It can be difficult for a Christian who may be more moderate, more diplomatic, in communication. So you need to be mindful of that some Christians are going to be very socially active, that is, activists of some kind. And then you may go to some churches where there's little or no activity, little or no life. You almost feel like the church is in a state of decay. And so instead of the growth, there is decay. Sometimes there can be growth in decay. I mean, you look at the drug penicillin, the culture that it grows from mold, it changes. So decay may also bring growth. So I guess we need to remember that, as difficult as it may be to be in a church that feels like it's on its way out. When we think of languages, is that a deterrent or is that an opportunity? Lord knows in America, yes, a lot of English speaking, but we have, just in LA, we have over 230 languages spoken. So, I believe a language barrier is an opportunity, not a deterrent. Certainly, once again, I've had to teach people who maybe their ability was, they're just getting started with the language. But we need to show encouragement and find other ways to communicate. So, intercultural ministry, sometimes you can work, co-create things even with people who do not speak the same language. It's not always easy, but if it's God's will that you build relationship regardless of obstacles, every relationship has obstacles, even ones that don't have language obstacles. So when you look at it from that intercultural perspective, it makes it a little easier to accept that yes, there are going to be issues. That's just part of it, but that's okay. You may come here and be puzzled by the way people act. It may be their individualistic ways, it may be a lack of courtesy, it may be actually some people are so friendly so soon that you're puzzled by that. They may just meet you and like you immediately, but you're like, wow, we haven't had enough time to build a relationship. So that can be very confusing. But like any country, we have people with different personalities, different backgrounds. So you need to certainly be comfortable and safe in all relationships, but it may be puzzling, and sometimes I personally like to accept people's kindness and thoughtfulness. You also may meet people who are very cold, and it may take years to build a relationship with them. So that, God figures all that out, and He allows relationships to happen, and He allows you to learn and teach and experience, and the relationships get built. I have seen so much evangelism here. I was taking a bus to the beach, and I more than once encountered missionaries from other countries, missionaries to the U.S., and they were evangelizing on a bus. And so there's a lot of evangelism happening here. Some of it formal, some of it informal, some of it highly orchestrated, some of it not highly planned. So your Christian perspective of prayer and love goes a long way. And within the intercultural atmosphere of America, you will find you will be challenged. You will have difficulties. But if you are following God to the T, meaning you are following a loving king and you are using his example, I believe you will be highly pleased with your progress. Even the difficult times, you will find gratefulness, you will find love, you will find understanding of so many different people and different things because you gave yourself the chance to go through that struggle and improve your life and improve the lives of others. So sacrifice and struggle are not bad things. They're actually very, very good things. And we have talked before about Dr. Sharon Kim, and she talks about hybrid churches in Southern California, and that are always changing. They have different combinations of things, and I always use the analogy of waves and things going in and out, in and out. So if you are in and out is not just a hamburger place, right? In and Out, of course, is a famous hamburger place in California. But when I say in and out, even your feelings of why am I here? This is so hard. There are so many obstacles. How do I bring people into relationship with Christ? And how do I bring people into relationship with me, both other Christians and non-Christians? Well, the answer is through the saving grace and love of Jesus Christ. And having the endurance of a marathon runner, not giving up, being tough, and also welcoming difference, welcoming change, and welcoming challenge. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed these ministry stories, and I hope they have added to your learning. God loves you, and thank you so much for being here today. Have a great day.